for our next session to Paula. We have Gabriel Columbro, Executive Director from Finos, today with us, and he'll have a conversation with Paula on open source and fintech perspectives from the Finos organization. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, Simeon. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you all for hanging in there. We've got an exciting session here planned with my colleague Gab here. I'll introduce him as the Executive Director of the Finos organization. Gab is a great person to talk to about what's going on with open source and the fintech sector. He's had experience with the largest financial institutions in the world, and we want to tap into his wisdom today and understand more about the Finos organization, but also why the need for open source and what are the barriers and what are the opportunities to engage the fintech sector. So with that, first, welcome, Gab. I'll let you tell us a little bit more about the Finos organization and why was there a need for an open source foundation focused on fintech when you started this initiative several years ago?
Well, first of all, thank you, Paula. Can you folks hear me okay?
Yep.
We can hear you fine, Gabriel.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to, collaborate and cross-pollinate our communities. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, it's been I think an interesting story. Actually, we used to be called the Symphony Software Foundation, where we got started in late 2015. Originally, we were looking to collaborate around one specific platform called Symphony, which is a messaging and collaboration platform created by the largest, as you said, financial institutions in the world. But as we, built trust amongst our board and our community, especially in an industry that, as you know, is pretty conservative and siloed in nature, we realized that there was a much broader opportunity. That was about mid-2017, and the context we were moving in was changing. The fintech wave, the decentralized platforms and ecosystem, a talent crunch that becomes sort of bigger and bigger as more and more talent, favors tech companies versus financial institutions in terms of being able to not only participate to open source communities, but truly innovate without sort of some of that burden that comes by working for a regulated industry, sort of regulated company. And so that's where, with our board, we realized that there was room for a financial services, fintech specific foundation. If you think about it, most open source foundations out there, whether it's the Linux Foundation or which we are now part of, or Apache Software Foundation, most foundations are really very much horizontal, centered around a certain piece of software and generally spanning across industries. But we realized that there was a large enough amount of software that is specific to the financial services industry, and that it's by and large not mutualized, oftentimes duplicative and non-differentiating. That was really the first realization whereby we thought, a foundation that can shepherd this collaboration, could make a lot of sense, would have a place in the tech landscape. But secondly, was really to make sure we acknowledge that, again, as a regulated industry, as regulated companies, there are additional complexities in participating to open source communities, and that is not just consuming, that is about contributing. And having spent about 20 years in the open source community, those are issues that typically don't get addressed by mainstream open source communities. Some people don't even understand that maybe someone at Goldman Sachs cannot access GitHub in their day job. And so that was sort of the second part of the equation, understanding that there is a lot of education that needs to be done in this industry to get to the point that they can contribute to open source, and make sure that we could provide a tool chain that this organization would feel comfortable to use to contribute to open source. And so that's really, again, opportunity and the understanding that we needed to handhold this industry to get to be a productive open source community.
Great. But I imagine there's some challenges that these large organizations have faced with regard to open source. They've, you've got the banks, the FinTech vendors, you've got individuals that want to participate in open source. Can you expand a little bit more on those challenges?
Absolutely. I definitely looked much younger 5 years ago. It definitely hasn't been an easy ride, but yeah, I mean, I think for us, again, when I 5 years ago started pitching some of these firms this idea that, again, it's not just about consuming open source. A lot of them were telling me, yeah, we're using Red Hat, we do open source. I was like, well, how about contributing upstream? And so it really starts by understanding who are the players in this ecosystem. And to your point, it started with banks. 3 or 4 years ago, those who told me, no, we do not use open source, those are probably the ones, most in trouble, because in fact, every organization uses open source. As much as, you think at executive level that maybe open source is not flowing into the organization, developers will find a way to use, powerful, sorry about that, folks, powerful open source tools, to accelerate their business. And so, what we focused on with banks was really turning this consumption into contribution and making the case that, really upstream contribution is the one that ultimately delivers the ROI of open source. Because ultimately, if you need to maintain your own copy of a piece of software that exists out there, might as well go proprietary. That will cost you more than, again, from a corporate standpoint, than actually, just buying a piece of software. And so with the banks, it's been a whole lot about, first of all, sort of creating the strategy awareness as to why at exec level they should be considering open source as a pillar of their technology strategy, and then making sure that we removed frictions. From a legal standpoint, there's still a lot of myths to be debunked in some of these sort of compliance organizations about open source. Technology toolchain. Some of these organizations didn't used to have a way to approve contributors. And again, when you're talking corporate participation to an open source project, of course, you need to make sure that, again, CLAs are in place and all the sort of legal framework is there. So there's been a lot of first enabling through getting the executives on board and then removing frictions. And then on the flip side, FinTech vendors. It's interesting because, you'd expect, coming from, again, I'm based in San Francisco, coming from, quote unquote, the Silicon Valley, where sort of open source and commercial open source are, the norm. I would have expected more maturity from FinTech vendors in terms of how they can leverage open source as a commercial business model. But I think that's our next big challenge. We're working, we're getting more and more engagement for these vendors. But again, I think there's a lot of inroads and potentially a commercial opportunity there. But finally, again, communities are made of individuals. And, there is an element of me having, grown up in open source. I certainly wouldn't be here if I wasn't an Apache committer about 15 years ago. And so there's an element of sort of enabling very good developers and great talent in these organizations to be able to continue fostering their own profile, by contributing outside in the open. And so I think, just to wrap, the most complex part of the journey has been really what we call the frozen middle. It's easy in a way now, if we think it's changed. It's easy to get executives on board. It's certainly easy to get developers on board with the idea of contributing to open source. It's really all that's in between in terms of trying to align benefits and risks for them.
Great, thanks for that. So having contributions from across the ecosystem obviously is the objective for any community, open source community. How have you progressed on that? Have you convinced the financial institutions to contribute code, to assign developer resources to some of the projects?
Yes, I have to say this year, a lot of the initiatives that we've done over the last few years to, again, create the right conditions for these organizations to contribute into the open source community. I'm happy to report that this year we're seeing a stark increase of contributions from banks. Over the last, I would say mostly in 2017, 2018, our big focus was what we call open source readiness. We have an ongoing bi-weekly meetings, we produce white papers, we provide reference contribution policies for these organizations. So for 2 years, really the goal was to, again, get through the legal hurdle. And, by now, I think about 80% of our financial institutions, again, even large ones, have a legal framework in place with us, have signed a CLA, their developers are able to contribute into Finos. And that has driven, a very high participation from our members, not anymore just, your typical working groups, your meetings. Those were something that we saw early traction 2 or 3 years ago, but actually in terms of contributing code. This year, over 60% of our new projects, I think 6 out of 9 projects came from financial institutions. It's code that got open sourced from Morgan Stanley, Citi, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and several of our other members. And we're starting to see, again, this is sort of the next step, but our factor of success, our KPIs are not just, each one contributes its own project. And of course, there's value there. We want to be the commons when it comes to, FinTech. But the goal is to have, cross adoption and cross contribution. And so now what we're starting to see is actually, a couple of our projects being adopted in production by other firms or being contributed to by other firms. So definitely, we've seen a stark acceleration this year, even compared to last year. And I want to say, while I'd love to, take full credit for that in terms of what we've done over the last few years, I think this very particular year and the pandemic had something to do with it. I think everyone is seeing a sort of this digital acceleration whereby even the most conservative firms are now, okay to work from home and, take meetings on Zoom. Tomorrow I got my board meeting on Zoom tomorrow. I think it played a part in actually accelerating also how comfortable some of these firms are with allowing their developers to contribute code across the firewall. We just announced probably our biggest project today, yesterday. It's a contribution from Goldman Sachs called Legend. So, we're looking good. It took a while, and I don't think we're by any chance at the end of the road. There's still so much more to do, but we can see now a sustainable ecosystem being built and fueled by organic contributions from these institutions.
That's excellent. It's encouraging to hear because we, of course, are in our infancy in comparison to you and the Linux Foundation, but starting to see some good traction. I'd be remiss if I didn't call out the contributions that our team at Mawali has made with their developers and their partners in contributing back to the Mojo code base. And it's so meaningful to the rest of the community to be talking to and engaging with folks that are actually in deployments. So hopefully we both continue to see further success on that. I noticed you recently launched an open RegTech SIG. How's it progressing, and what do you learn from the regulators?
That's an area that, thank you for asking. That's an area that I am particularly, that's particularly close to my heart. Just a little bit of background. As an open source community, especially, a strongly sort of corporate driven open source community, the goal is always ultimately to collaborate, and typically you end up collaborating on, code or standards that are sort of industry-wide, so whereby requirements apply, common requirements apply to a pretty large slice of the industry, as wide as possible. Again, our goal as a nonprofit is to advance the industry. And secondly, whereby, there's no differentiation, or this is not, your secret sauce. That's, of course, nobody here, I think, is willing to give out their secret sauce, and I think correctly. And so it really resonated for us over the last 12 months to say, hey, regulatory implementation could be one of these areas whereby, it's requirements that apply to everyone. It's a massive item on the bottom line, especially in the last 10, 12 years. Could open source be, a third way when it comes to this constant battle between regulation and deregulation? Can open source actually be, a way to make, regulation way more efficient, both from a, an implementation standpoint, from an enforcement standpoint with the regulators, and hopefully, in a few years from now, even from a production of the regulation standpoint. We would love to see machine readable regulation that can be, tested against in terms of unit tests and integration tests in the way that, as developers we're used to. And so earlier in the year, we launched this initiative called actually used to be called Open FinReg. We just renamed it to Open RegTech. And that has shown a lot of initial potential. We have interacted with, some of the most advanced regulators, the CFPB here in the US, the FCA in the UK. Actually, as I'm speaking, we're talking to the Bank of England. There certainly is a huge interest. Of course, we had to do some very similar sort of education path as we did with individual financial institutions a few years ago. There still are some, confusions from a legal standpoint, licensing standpoint. Does this mean that all of my data needs to be open and shared? No, but you still get some of those concerns. So in a way, I would plot regulators in sort of a similar scale of maturity that we plotted our financial institutions a few years ago. So there are some that we think are easier targets sort of to ease collaboration. Actually, we are hosting a tech sprint this week with our partner AIR, Alliance for Innovative Regulation, around crypto and KYC AML. So we're starting really to get not sort of beyond awareness, helping, again, be the open source enabler for some of these existing collaborations that regulators do. And so whilst we're still sort of in the phase of identifying, which areas of regulations we want to focus on, that's a huge topic there. My early impression for the last few months has been that, there are many regulators that want to do the right thing. When it comes to not just how the markets work, but really financial inclusion, ESG, diversity. I mean, I've joined a couple of these sort of regulator FinTech type conferences, and man, I thought I had to really convince them, not just about open source, but what I found is that they really want to do the right thing. It just is so hard to do, given it's at the crossroad of technology and policy. And so that's where we are trying to position open source. foundations like us have a lot of experience in not only managing technology and software, but also the governance and how do you do it in a transparent way, and how do you allow people to sort of meritocratically chime in into the decision-making process. And so we're really trying to use that. Again, I think the value for regulators is not just open source code, but it's the open way, is the open source approach to resolving problems that are, let's be honest, very complex to solve. And of course, certainly elections will have an impact as to how we progress on some of these topics. But yeah, the early feedback has been great. And while we don't have yet, tangible projects out there, there certainly are several components in FinOS that we think could be useful for regulators. So very, very promising. And I hope to be able to do more announcements later in the year.
Excellent. Thanks for that progress report. So are there any, coming back to technology, and of course, with your affiliation with the Linux Foundation, you have a very broad perspective on what's happening in the open source technology sector. Are there any key trends in technology that you feel are growing in importance for the FinTech sector?
Well, I think, yeah, and thanks for calling out us joining the Linux Foundation. That happened in April earlier in the year. And exactly one of the reasons, there were many reasons for consolidation. I'm about building bridges rather than competing when, we're all going after a similar cause, and open source is about being inclusive and cross-pollinating. So apart from sort of joining our communities, one of the main reasons why we joined the Linux Foundation was to really expand our footprint and, again, continue the sort of East Coast, West Coast cross-pollination that we started. There is this sort of, in a way, hate and love relationship between Wall Street and big tech firms, but we think that really open source is one of the least best kept secrets from the open secret, we call it, from the West Coast, but it will continue giving advantage to tech firms versus financial institutions who are more and more sort of looking to become tech firms. But sort of to your question around trends, I think the main trend that we're still seeing is and that I think has a huge impact on open source is the move to cloud. For a couple of reasons. Most of these financial institutions are still, I would say, not in early stages, but certainly far from done when it comes to moving their workloads to the cloud and to public clouds. And of course, this is giving us an opportunity to work, as we mentioned before, with regulators and really provide, hopefully, standards that are industry-wide and would work both for, as much as for large financial institutions as for, fintechs coming to the game, and so really providing sort of this level playing field. But I think the second trend sort of related to it is, as we've seen in the broader open source community, and, I want to be careful here not to starting a philosophical debate, but, there's been, major companies leveraging the commoditization of software and the availability of very powerful open source components out there, to deliver that through SaaS and monetize that. Certainly software as a service provided and just, the availability of public clouds delivered another major way to monetize around open source. And what I think we'll see in this industry is a similar process. There are financial services specific components that could and should be commoditized, and could and probably will be delivered to through cloud. And so I think we haven't seen that yet. That commercial open source cloud business model taking off, but I think it's a major opportunity. And now that we have sort of active contributions, it's probably very much the next step. The second trend is more, again, centered around open source itself. And it's really this idea that, again, we talked at the beginning how we like to think ourselves as a vertical foundation focused on one specific industry, as opposed again to most open source foundations being centered around a piece of software and so horizontal. You know, one thing that is becoming clearer and clearer is if you look also at the broader landscape of projects that the Linux Foundation is putting forward, is that open source is moving closer and closer to the end user. It used to be, and it still in large part is, a way for technology companies to deliver. Again, if you look at it from a corporate standpoint, of course, technology companies leverage open source, faster time to market, whether it's their commercial business model. But what we're seeing more and more is open source being used to deliver solutions to end users' problems, or you know, think about, again, us as financial services institutions, or more recently, the LF Climate Initiative, or the LF Public Health working on you know, contact tracing and other COVID-related apps. So I think what we're seeing, and I'm very glad this is happening, we're seeing open source kind of going back in a way to what I think sort of the ideal of open source was when it was created. It does deliver more sort of solutions in an efficient way, again, directly to the end users. And when you know, it comes to us, we want to think that this is going to help these financial institutions providing much better, again, user experience to their users. So therefore, to any one of us, sort of average Joes participating to the financial system and sort of downstream to the financial technology complex. So hopefully we'll continue this trend and continue fostering it, but definitely we're seeing open source expanding beyond being, you know, just a great tool to build technology. It's becoming hopefully a much sort of more powerful approach to solve long-standing problems. And that's why I'm here.
And that too is why we're here. And you know, a lot of your members are very large commercial corporations. They have their philanthropic activities that they focus on. Yeah. What are their thoughts about financial inclusion? And are there any interesting projects in this area you'd like to highlight?
Well, funny you asked that, because it's been certainly a conversation that you know, we had very seriously over the last few months, especially at our last board meeting. You know, this year has been a very, very particular year for everyone, and you know, not only, of course, for the pandemic, but for the, you know, moments of social reckoning that we all are going through, and, you know, frankly, are much overdue. And so earlier in the year, you know, we had a really deep conversation with our board. You know, we, as you say, represent some very, you know, a very fat slice of the industry when it comes to, you know, again, large, massive corporations that, if put together, could have a massive impact on some of these, you know, higher order problems, I would call them, you know, whether it's financial inclusion, again, sustainability, or even, again, diversity, which is diversity and inclusion, which is as much a problem in the financial services industry as it is, frankly, in open source communities, unfortunately. And so whilst we don't have yet, hopefully that'll come soon, we don't have projects that are yet focused on financial inclusion, we are at the stage of our life cycle where, you know, as I said before, the last 2 years were really focused on getting banks to contribute. There wasn't, you know, there wasn't going to be an organic community without active contributors. We are now this year experiencing, okay, if you want the luxury of, okay, now we have these organic contributions, how do we go about, you know, either coupling those components that we have to deliver a solution to an industry problem, or how do we start, new initiatives together to solve fundamental, long-standing industry issues. And so where we landed as a board was, our focus still has to be, we still have some inroads to do into sort of our core mission, which is, making the financial services system more efficient, more interoperable, avoiding duplication where is non-competitive. That still remains our sort of first and foremost goal. But we are, that doesn't mean that in the process, we cannot look at making a bigger impact on some of these higher order issues like financial inclusion. So definitely it's a conversation that started, and definitely this is one of the reasons why I'm here and having conversation with Mojoloop. It is something that for us becomes a priority in 2021. So I am in the research phase, candidly, right now.
Great. Oh, happy to continue the conversation. So I have one last question, but I'm going to make it a two-parter because there's a question from the audience as well.
Cool.
As you know, we're a relatively new organization. Are there any words of wisdom you'd like to deliver to our community? And part two of that question, specifically from the audience, is what are the motivations freezing the middle? Do you have any learnings for thawing them? So new organization and thawing the middle.
Yes. So my first, well, I'll start with the second one, and then maybe I'll go back to the first one. The frozen middle, I think for me, it's all fundamentally askew, or the simply said, the cost benefit equation is skewed drastically towards cost, or let's say the risk benefit. In financial institutions, as you can imagine, especially our footprint is in investment banking, so the closest of the closest in terms of sort of how close they are to their jewels. But it's certainly folks that have a very good understanding of risk assessments, and they based a lot of their decision of risk profiles. They're very detailed about that. And so I think when it comes to I guess most common experience has been that when it comes to the frozen middle, there is much more to lose, quote unquote, or to risk in terms of compliance, in terms of delivering the next milestone of the next project when maybe your developers don't even have access to GitHub, when sometimes you don't even know the lawyer that you need to talk to within a 50,000 people company that would potentially even think about signing a CLA. And so while on the other hand, yes, if you're a really very ambitious person, you can certainly, I have no doubt that many of my board members have gotten a career boost by, being the open source stewards in their organization, because open source is here to stay. But I think, again, to the question, specific to the question, I think there is a fundamental disbalance or unbalance towards, which incentive they have to stay and maintain the status quo versus which incentives, that frozen middle has to actually make a change. We have seen some success, much easier sort of engagement from the middle management when as I said before, there is a clear top-down understanding from the execs as to why open source is important, and ideally there is already a CLA in place, or at least a contribution policy in place. Once those two pillars are there, the frozen middle comes around much easier. To the first question around recommendations for a new community. Look, I come from the Apache Software Foundation. I grew up in the Apache Software Foundation. And so I grew up with the Apache way. I grew up with, if it's not on the list, it didn't happen. I grew up with people emailing me and me replying to a list of 500 people because, hey, you shouldn't just be talking to me. You should, let the community transparently know. And I've tried to apply verbatim that approach when I joined in 2015, 2016. And, whilst I think now we are in a place where I see lively conversations happening transparently in GitHub or transparently on our mailing lists. And, it took a few years to build this level of trust. I guess my first recommendation is understand that this is a very different, if you come from the mainstream open source community, understand that this is a very different industry. Applying, sort of dropping the open source mantra on an organization that has been for decades siloed and conservative doesn't work. You need to sort of ease them into understanding why it's important for them to be transparent. And I gotta say, from a compliance standpoint, there is a very compelling argument. Open source, again, when I say it's not just code, has proven to be a really compliant way for this regulated industry to collaborate. We have antitrust policies, we have conflict of interest policies. Now my banks feel comfortable to talk in our forums, openly, knowing that they're not violating any regulation out there. So that's my first suggestion. I think the end game should always be meritocracy, transparency, and the open source communities that we're used to, but just understand that it's going to take some time. And related to it, don't try to over govern. We went through 3 or 4 iterations of our governance. Of course, you need to put your foot down and the pillars there to make sure that, again, antitrust, conflict of interest, just merely transparency with the community and individual contributors that, might feel daunted when you have such a large financial institution collaborating with you on a project. So of course, put the pillars, but don't go overboard with governance in terms of trying to govern every single little thing and every single sort of decision-making procedure. That'll come when things become really valuable and people are using them in production and they're contributing to it. Conflicts are going to rise. And if you have built that trust, then you have, credit to spend on saying, hey guys, now we need to update this governance. We need to, sort of bulletproof it, if that makes sense. So that would be my second suggestion from being burned.
Excellent. Excellent. Gab, it's so great to hear your perspective. It's reassuring to know that these challenges that we face are not unique and that there's someone that's tackling them ahead of us. So we hope to continue to collaborate. And of course, in the spirit of that collaboration, the Linux Foundation has generously offered us speaking opportunities at their upcoming events. Their open source summit is starting today through next week. And we encourage our members to participate in those sessions and also listen in on the Mojaloop presentation October 26th. And then the Finos organization is having their open source strategy forum on November 12th and 13th. So we encourage you all here in this community to partake of those sessions, because I think you'll find that they're useful and give interesting perspective on open source and the FinTech sector. So again, thanks, Gab. It's great to hear from you. Great to hear your perspectives. And let's keep the dialogue open. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And you keep up the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Awesome. Gab, before I let you go, we have one more question from Mr. Michael Richards. I'll let Michael close it up with us for us.
Oh, thanks very much, Simon. But I think mine was the question that was answered about unfreezing the frozen middle.
Awesome.
Hopefully with a good answer.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gab and Paula.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Awesome.